But certainly it became clear to Castro that the United States was not going to help his revolution. And particularly after Cuban emigres moved to the United States and started building U.S. hostility toward Castro, Castro started to look elsewhere for support and looked to the Soviet Union and started to build a relationship there.
For all of Castro's talk of freedom, he instituted a one-party political system and kept a firm grip on Cuba's infrastructure, fearful that the U.S. would try to gain control of the country. Castro faced threats from the inside and the outside. Counter-revolutionaries in Cuba, anti-Castro Cubans now living in the United States, and the United States government, which became increasingly hostile as Castro began to seize foreign business interests. When John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, he inherited a plan from the Eisenhower administration to sponsor an attack of Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Developed by the Central Intelligence Agency, it was essentially a counter-revolution that funded and supplied Cuban exiles to recapture Cuba. On April 16, 1961, Castro announced to Cubans that their country would develop along a socialist path, bringing new benefits to ordinary Cubans. The very next day, the U.S.-backed invasion of Cuba began.
Throughout the 20th century, the United States has felt that it had the moral right to intervene in Latin American politics for the sake of keeping peace in the hemisphere. And beyond that, after World War II, with the onset of the Cold War, the United States felt it had the responsibility to intervene anywhere in the world where a communist government might come to power. And so Cuba was kind of a double dip in this respect. Cuba was only 90 miles off the shore of the United States. It was a traditional area in which the U.S. had exercised influence and in which U.S. companies had substantial investments. And it was also a region where there was some risk that the Soviet Union would exert influence. And so any hint of communism in the Western Hemisphere has always been particularly fiercely opposed by the United States.
The U.S. invasion was a total failure. Because of huge popular support, Castro had little trouble capturing the exile force, which the U.S. later ransomed for $53 million in medicine and food. Castro was jubilant about defeating the United States' attempt to reassert itself in Cuba. For Fidel Castro, the failed invasion was a public relations windfall. His small nation had stood up to the most powerful country in the world. At home and abroad, Castro's reputation soared. Cuba's relations with the United States grew predictably and steadily worse. The United States imposed a virtually complete economic embargo on Cuba. Cut off from supplies and trade closer to home, Castro reached out to the enemy of its enemy, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union began supporting Cuba economically and supplied technicians to help it industrialize. In addition to economic and technical assistance, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev offered Cuba nuclear missiles to help Castro protect his revolution. Castro greatly feared another, larger invasion from the United States and accepted the weapons, setting in motion a crisis that pushed the world to the edge of a catastrophic nuclear war. It wasn't long before President Kennedy learned that Cuba had Soviet missiles that were capable of carrying nuclear weapons and could reach much of the United States in a matter of minutes. In response, Kennedy announced a naval blockade around Cuba that would prevent the arrival of additional Soviet missiles, warheads, and technicians.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
What would Khrushchev do? Would he turn his ships around? Attempt to run the blockade? Or would he do the unthinkable, fire the missiles already in Cuba? In the end, cooler heads prevailed. Khrushchev ordered his missile-carrying freighters to turn back from Cuba and promised to dismantle the missiles already there. In return, the United States promised not to invade Cuba and to later remove U.S. nuclear missiles from Turkey, where they were based only 150 miles from the Soviet Union. The crisis was averted. The Cuban Missile Crisis served to emphasize that Castro and his countrymen were still far from their dream of a truly independent Cuba. Over the next several decades, the United States did not invade Cuba again, but continued its strict economic embargo. In 1991, with the end of the Cold War and the dismantling of the Soviet Union, Cuba's longtime protector and chief economic supporter ceased to exist. Cuba was independent, but opposed by its powerful neighbor, the United States, the country struggled on its own. Over the years, the Cuban economy has stagnated. Time and again, Castro has appealed to his countrymen to tighten their belts and prepare to do without some product or service they had previously enjoyed. Gasoline and food have been rationed, and even pencils and paper are frequently scarce commodities. Often, Castro has used the threat of an American invasion to whip up support for his austerity programs, as Cuba has struggled on. Politically, Castro has been able to maintain his power through harsh repression, imprisoning dissidents, and virtually eliminating freedom of expression and assembly.
There's an educational system that works better and is more equitable. There is a health system that works and is more equitable. There is a sense of social solidarity. At the same time, in economic terms, it hasn't been a dramatic success.
On the island of Cuba, there's still large numbers of people who see Castro as a hero, who see the revolution as the shining moment of Cuba's history, where Cubans stood up for themselves and improved the lot of average Cubans. If those close followers continue to share Castro's commitment to maintaining the communist revolution as it is now, then things may not change very much. It's usually taken not only the death of a revolutionary leader, but the passage of an entire revolutionary generation for things to change where revolutions have occurred.